Hey, Transworld Business Advisors, and I'm here with Lisa Kahn. We haven't done one of these in 2 years because we thought we were back to normal.
Yeah, time flies, huh? We must have been having fun.
Yeah. So I thought of doing this with Lisa again because I think we're in a new world. Obviously, there's a lot going on the immigration front. And I think we all definitely need to have some insight with regard to what's happening, what we're seeing, kind of those. I know we used to not talk about sizes of companies or sizes of business. That was always an intuitive question. And I think it's clearly shifted. But then also, has there been an edict from on high with regard to immigration, or has there not? So with that, thanks for doing this, and I'll let you kind of opine a bit.
Okay. So interestingly, with regard to E2 visas, as before, the rules haven't really changed. The regulations haven't really changed in any significant way. So absent some sort of legal change to the visa category, to the criteria set, to the classification of the criteria, there shouldn't be changes, but we're seeing some changes, and that happens kind of on a policy level, on a how we're adjudicating level, and it really varies consulate to consulate. So that makes it tricky, and a lot depends, frankly, on who's sort of in charge and what's going on at the particular consulates. So some consulates are tough right now for E2 visas, and others, it is business as usual, or they're fairly lenient with approvals. So it's inconsistent, is what I'm seeing, and that's probably been my biggest frustration as an immigration attorney since the beginning, is inconsistent adjudications, whether they're coming out of an embassy or whether they're coming from USCIS. You would like to think that two cases that are almost identical sorts of facts would get the same adjudication, regardless of when it was filed, where it was filed, but that's not always the case. So with regard to the E2s, where we're seeing a lot of problems is what used to be a very friendly E2 consulate, and that's London. Starting last summer, maybe I would say, we started seeing some really inconsistent adjudications coming out of the London embassy. And it wasn't unique to just, me. Other attorneys that do a lot of E2s were also seeing inconsistent adjudications coming out of London as well. We had some surprising denials for cases that otherwise would have been really good. The trends that I'm seeing in London are a few. So one is that they're really looking carefully at renewals where someone has been in the US a long time, or not only have they been in the US a long time and they're renewing after 10, 15 years, but where they have a lot of family ties in the US as well. So an example of a case we had a problem with to renew was a solid business doing very well financially and creating plenty of jobs for US workers, but they also had several family members on the payroll. Another family was here on an E2 for a related entity, and the spouse was working in their business. And I think the embassy kind of got this feeling that, somebody's come to the US, set up an E2 company, and now they're spinning off or they're selling part of their company to other family members, whether it's a daughter-in-law or a brother-in-law, and they're trying to bring everybody over to the US. So in that scenario, they really couldn't deny the visa for it being a non-operational business or marginal business, but they denied it, saying, we don't think that you have the intent to depart the US should your E2 classification end or terminate. So that was an interesting one. Intent to depart usually has just been, an assertion by the E2 visa holder that, hey, if my visa ends or I close the business or sell the business, I'm not going to hang around the US. I intend to depart. And it was just a matter of signing one line. Now they were kind of hanging their hat on that when they felt like, we don't really like this, that people are coming to the US and maybe using it as a way to stay for a really long time. So in that scenario, because it really was a solid case, we refiled the whole thing in Toronto. Toronto will accept third country national cases. We fully disclosed everything and said they have the intent to depart. They intend one day to retire in the UK. They wrote a lengthy statement explaining that. They went to Toronto and 3-4 questions, boom, 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 here's your visa. So that's really unfortunate because you're just seeing different standards at different places. So that was one example of a renewal that we had trouble with in London. But we've also had some issues where for first-time E2s, in London, they seem very sensitive right now to people that are buying a business, especially from another E2 visa holder, whether they're unrelated or not, where they're spinning off part of the company. They're really scrutinizing that. So somebody with a big pool cleaning company with 350 clients that wants to sell 100 of those pool clients and sort of sell a segment of their business, they're really having a hard time with that. And I don't understand why in London, because it's a legitimate business that can provide an income, etc. But that kind of context with like service agreements or property management, part of it is coming from, I think, a lack of training and officers that are adjudicating E2s that may not be that well trained or that familiar with it. And they're erring on the side of saying no rather than saying yes. So we were seeing some really, oddball adjudications where there was a couple that was buying property management contracts from an existing property management company and going to do their own thing. And the officer said, well, you're buying 30 contracts. Have you visited all 30 of the homes? And they said, well, no, we haven't physically gone and driven around and looked at all 30 of those homes.
I mean, most of the time that's not even allowed. That's not how the process. So is it ignorance or youth? Did these people did COVID have a lot of, did like the forced retirements or the offer of retirement happen and people punched?
I don't really know, but other attorneys started saying what's going on in London as well. And there is some sort of, in one case, when we had those denials, we filed with the State Department to say, hey, we think that there's a legal error that's been made at the consulate. And then we let the State Department know. Sometimes they'll respond and say, well, no, we back up our officers and it was a factual issue. Sometimes they just don't even respond. But the more that attorneys kind of let the State Department know that, hey, maybe there's an issue here with a particular embassy and the adjudications, then they'll sort of start to pay attention sometimes. But all we could really get out of what was going on in London is that they've got about 10 officers or so that are adjudicating different applications, and that they may not all be that well trained.
They responded that way?
Well, and not so much that they don't think they necessarily said that they are poorly trained, but they sort of said, well, we have a lot of officers. And did I disconnect us?
No, I'm here.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I was looking for a document while we were talking, and I want to make sure I didn't click the wrong button. They essentially just said we have a lot of officers and we're rotating them through. And so the adjudication standards, I think maybe sometimes that results in maybe some inconsistency. So that was about as good as they might have been.
That's an artful response that doesn't commit to, yeah, we have a problem and we're working on it.
Yeah. So, so the problems that I'm seeing have been mostly out of London, to be honest. Toronto has been, honestly, fingers crossed, lovely to work with and very accepting of third country national cases, meaning somebody who's not Canadian. Still taking about 30 days to review, very reasonable adjudications. Sometimes I'm hesitant to broadcast that because then everybody and their brother wants to file in Toronto, and then Toronto might say, what's going on here? We're going to have to shut this down. We've been pretty open about taking other cases from other countries, but if they get overwhelmed, then that could be the end of that.
What's who takes third party adjudications other than Canada?
So if there's a reason for it, and you might recall, we had a client in South America who national of one country.
Yeah, he's actually one of my agents. He's an agent now too. He works for me.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So that, in that case, we were able to pivot and say, hey, this embassy had a bombing and they're not taking the case. And then a neighboring country.
El Salvador, yeah.
We had somebody recently I had someone who is from, I think, if they're living in another country, so someone could be a Spanish national living in France, and it's fine then to file maybe in France. I had somebody who was Polish, and we filed her case in Russian, but living in, I think, dual citizen of Poland. So we filed it in Warsaw, and it was very smooth there. France has been pretty good. Most of the consulates have been okay, to be honest with you. And frankly, immigration here, USCIS, when we're filing to maybe change someone's status over to an E2 or extend their current E2 status, they've been pretty good too. So I haven't really been seeing any problems there.
This is the London issue at present.
It's a largely London issue, which is a bummer for us because we're in Central Florida and there's a lot of British folks that are, are wanting to invest in businesses in Central Florida, and normally they'd be going to London.
I remember 2005. That was 20 years ago. Do you remember when we had some similar dynamic? There was that one consulate officer who was just a lunatic.
Yeah.
And I remember us it was as uncertain. It was 6 months. It was a year. Right. And I remember we finally got our act together. Between the brokers and the powers that be, and the complaints started to stack up that finally got put away.
Yeah.
Do we need to do that again?
I think maybe eventually it will change. The one good thing is that the consular officers don't stay forever, which is good and bad. When you've got a good consular officer team and it's going great, you think, oh, don't change it. We this is working well. But they do rotate in and out. And so they never stay in any particular post, maybe more than 2 years. So it won't last forever. So if there's some bad apples, they'll move on somewhere else, but we don't always know where they're going to go.
We don't believe it's a, State Department, old Marco has kind of made a ruling to crush E2. I don't think they even pay attention to that.
There might be some officers, to be honest, though, that are taking America First policy very seriously. So there was a directive, kind of a very vague directive to the State Department, that when you're adjudicating visas, it's an America First mindset. So that could be interpreted a little bit liberally for some that might feel like, oh, these people have a business in the US, but they're creating a lot of jobs for extended family members. They're not hiring Americans, even though there were, in that one scenario, there were US workers as well. That could be color a little bit of their attitude. So it could,
like the one we had the issue with in Brazil.
Yeah.
Now, we didn't want him to go to Brazil. He mandated
right.
that he goes there. So let's
I don't think that was the strongest E2 case to start with.
Yeah, he was going cheap. So that'll take us down 2 paths. It's like we formerly could do stuff for under $100,000. And now
right. Yeah, I think you have London, I wouldn't try anything for under 100.
Yeah.
Toronto, you could probably still get away with it.
Yeah.
But I think it's always going to be easier when somebody spends more money on a more solid business with decent tax returns that has employees, when we're trying to sell these businesses where the taxes aren't so great, or there's a loss, but let me explain why, or we're going to turn it around, or the books aren't so good, or this is the third owner in 3 years, so I got a half a year's tax. That's always going to be more challenging. And sometimes, we do the best we can, and we can present those cases and make, they can be approved, but it's a tougher sell.
Yeah. So the sellers need to, so we got a lot of expats who got in a different world, who came here under a different paradigm.
Yeah.
Now the paradigm has shifted.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, the exchange rates have gone 180 degrees in the opposite direction. So the buyers don't have the capital. The rules of thumb that applied 3-5 years ago don't apply any longer. Yeah. And the consulates have changed.
Right. And I did a renewal for somebody that I had not represented before. And they got in on a $40,000 investment. I was kind of shocked. And it was a share purchase from a parent. So I was like, oh, that's a lot of red flags. But they got in the door and they've been doing okay. And the renewal, I think it's okay. But I don't think I would even attempt something like that today.
Well, this is, it's funny because, I naturally get the inquiries and they're like, well, what's everybody wants these touchstones of what's the left limit, what's the right limit, how can I save money? And those are variables given the exchange rates, but it's far more nuanced. And, a couple of things I try and tell people, it's like, look at USCIS, but it's not, there's human error both on the application process and processing it. There's I've seen Canadians trying to get in on the cheap, just kind of like they're punching a ticket, and I'm like, it doesn't work that way. And then they end up shopping to attorneys because you're not going to tell them what they want to hear. And I'm like, well, that guy or gal's going to take the $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, whatever the hell they're charging,
right?
Because there's no real risk for them if they're one of those big mill jobs. And I'm like,
Sure.
I don't want you to fail because you're going to lose money on the deal anyway. So you probably need to maybe step back 6 months, hoard cash, and then pivot. So we've learned that, $100,000, but there's it's sad that it's not consistent.
Yes.
But the client for you and mine ultimately is in charge of the decision. And you and I both knew when he went through Brazil, he decreased his likely success path, probably in 50% because it's not a treaty country.
Right. And so that's a good point. When you have somebody who's a national of a country where we don't have a treaty, the embassy is willing to take an E2 if you have dual nationality. So someone that has a Spanish passport or an Italian passport could apply in Brazil, but you can get inconsistent adjudications because they're just not doing a lot of E2s.
And in that one, we kind of, what they describe him as: young, attractive, and a kid. The right? That's what they remember. And I'm like, and do I do an appeal? And we're like, what's the point? The State Department doesn't have to respond. And unfortunately, the E2s, even though it's vital to like the local economy, it's not something that's done in other markets. And again, human error and people just reading the intent, which gets murky at times.
Right.
So what do I get first pass inquiry before they get to you sometimes. What am I telling these folks now?
As I think similar to what we've said before, if you can find it, I think under 100,000 is always going to be tough. So 100,000 or more is going to be in the ballpark of what you need to be looking at for businesses that have decent, financials, some, tax returns that aren't a mess. They, when we do the add backs and have to explain the tax returns, that's, the consulates don't always look at that. They're a little more black and white. They're looking at sales. They're looking at profit. They're looking at compensation of office.
Yeah, they can't read a financial statement.
Not really, not that well. So they're going to just kind of look at the black and white.
They look at the front page, right? That's all they can understand.
Pretty much. So we want a nice front page if possible. They would like to see, job creation. So W-2s and/or 1099s for subcontractors. And that's, that's the heart of it, really. So, but sometimes just getting those things is a challenge.
Yeah, no, it really is. And then the inventories, I looked at the inventory count yesterday. It's half of what it was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So the visa buyer, they hate when I tell them this. I'm like, you don't have a lot of choice here. What qualifies. Now you have subjective elements to the process that we didn't have.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, do you know? I said, I don't do the processing. You need to talk to an experienced attorney who lives it every day and is getting the feedback.
Yeah.
Like I'm reading tea leaves over here, seeing what's happening, and then I'll call you and go, hey, what the hell's going on?
Sure.
But I see the transactions. Now I see this one. Now I see the brokers aren't even taking, unless you buy, we're not processing the visa because they can do that because there's so few good deals. Right.
I have somebody who reached out to me today that wants to buy a business that's a solid business, nice tax returns. It looks really good, needs a visa. And they said, boy, the broker is just insisting that we buy it first. And I said, you really should not do that, because if you buy the business and you own it, but you don't have the visa, you can't run it. And God forbid, if there is a problem with the visa, you now own a business and you can't run it. Still, what are you going to do?
You can't get credit cards. You can't, how are you going to cash flow it? Right.
Right. So it's not a good idea to buy the business first. But she said this particular broker was really pushing it and said there's other people interested.
I can tell you exactly who it is.
Maybe you can. We'll talk about it on the side.
Yeah. I can tell you who it is.
But yeah. And and then there are some ways too, where, if you find yourself in a spot working with an E2 buyer where there are others interested and the seller says, I don't want to wait a month or 3 months for the visa, everything's negotiable. So I've told some clients, I said, maybe sweeten the deal, offer more than the other people for the business, or offer a non-refundable deposit that's higher than the norm, so that at least, you know, if it didn't go through, the seller says, at least I pocketed $15,000 or something before I had to. So,
you know, it's been a long time since I've done a change of status. Is that the path we may need to go until this sorts?
It can be an option, but you know, the downside of the change of status is that it, you know, the approval from a change, that's whether, you know, if they're here as a B1 visitor to an E2, it's good for 2 years, but it's not a visa. So most people don't like feeling that they're landlocked in the US for 2 years and that they can't travel. So if they get the 2-year change of status and they need to leave the country, they've got to still apply for the visa at the consulate.
Yeah, I just remember 05 and 06 with that scenario. And
it could be, you know, like 05, 06, when, you know, it was the only way, you know, for people were not going to get it. They were going to lose a business.
Right. And the difference then was they had an exchange rate. It was like 2 to 1 to the dollar, or 1 to 2 the pound to the dollar. So they were coming in basically with $100,000 more than whatever their first 100. So it didn't feel like a real loss, right? They could come in and they were leveraged up, and that the circumstances were still so low from the barrier at size wise, they were able to get it basically on, you know, I wouldn't want to say no money, but that hedged the risk of the landlock. Like, hey, I have 100,000 pounds. I bought a business for 100,000. I came in, it came 200,000. I buy the business for 90. I got my visa. Did I really lose 100? Because I still go back and have the original investment because I had, you know, a different exchange rate. Plus the barrier was lower. I mean, think of my lowest one back there. I did for 32 grand. You know?
Wow. Right? Yeah. Hey, while you're talking, I found this, the practice alert that I was looking for regarding the embassy in London. So it was kind of a practice alert from the American Immigration Lawyers Association, you know, with a lot of attorneys saying, what's going on in London? I've had a problem. I haven't seen this kind of thing before. So just to, you know, kind of share a little of the information, they're just saying, you know, since last year, members are reporting widespread reports from very experienced practitioners of unexpected refusals. And there was a meeting, an unofficial meeting with consular leadership through the American Immigration Lawyers Association. The consular representative said that they weren't implementing any changes in law, policy, or regulation, but they did say that there is no dedicated e-visa officer, and the interviews are conducted by a rotating pool of 14 officers, 2 of which are assigned to review the E2s each day. So you've got 14 officers, none of which is really a dedicated e-visa officer. In that mix, you're going to have some folks that probably just really don't know what they're doing, and they're scratching their head a little bit. And that's why I think we are seeing some unusual adjudications. And then they also did mention, not so much the consulate, but the Immigration Lawyers Association, that you know, there is an America First policy directive to the Secretary of State, and a little bit of this, you know, buy American, hire American mindset that could be coloring some of the adjudications.
Well, that is enlightening. Disconcerting.
And I can send that to you, you know, for what it's worth. I'll email it to you.
Yeah, I had a call from somebody up in my Michigan office because they get some up there in Chicago. And, you know, so they're asking me questions. I'm like, I'm clueless on what, you know, of course, when they ask the question, they don't tell me anything about the size of the business, what country they're coming from, But send me that if you could. So thanks for doing this. Our time is up. I'll send you a copy. Is there anything else you could recommend to these folks, given what we know? It's kind of like, how do we navigate?
Yeah, you know, I always recommend that somebody works, and you do the same, that somebody works with people that know the E2 visa. You know, if someone says, look, I'm going to work with a consultant who does a little bit of this and a little bit of that because they're going to charge me $3,000 and I can save a few $1,000s. I had somebody who contacted me this week. They said, we're on our second refusal, and we worked with an e-visa service that's not that, and you go to their website and it's all about, you don't need a lawyer. Well, they got 2 denials. So maybe they do need a lawyer. Maybe they need somebody that knows what they're doing. Maybe they need a good broker. And I'm always
the lawyer, accountant, you know, service consultant. I'm cheaper. Yeah, Swiss Army knives aren't good for surgery.
Yeah, exactly. So it doesn't have to be me, but I just am always surprised when people work with a non-attorney that's not regulated by the bar, or maybe, choose an attorney that's got a good rate, but they've only done 2 E2s in their life. Don't hire me for a deportation case because I don't know anything about it. But I do know the E2s. So yeah, as always, I think work with people that know what they're doing. You will save money in the long run for sure.
Yeah, look, you don't do a lot of EB5s, right? I don't think you've ever done one. And
I've done an EB5 and we did it successfully, but it took the life out of me. And it took forever.
Yeah, and it's like I do what I do and do what I do. Don't they're a different beast, and you have to be set up to handle that scale and breadth of work that's involved, because it's not a visa attorney. It's like doctors. You don't go to an anesthesiology for heart surgery.
100%. Same idea.
All right.
Yeah,
well,
but it's not
so
as all doom and gloom as we might think. It's
how do we get a hold of you?
Pardon me? Oh, my website is www.lisavisa.com, or my email is lisa@lisavisa.com.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Nice to talk with you, Mike.
Yep. All right.